Hey, so tonight, we're exploring one of history's most fascinating examples of mass hysteria and social psychology, a time when fear overcame reason and an entire community lost its way. We're talking about Salem, Massachusetts in 1692 during the witch trials that would ultimately teach us invaluable lessons about the importance of justice, critical thinking, and protecting the innocent. And here's something that'll fascinate you. What started with just two young girls having unusual symptoms would eventually involve accusations against over 200 people in less than a year. Imagine living in a place where your neighbor could make an accusation and suddenly you're facing serious legal consequences. That was the reality of Salem in 1692, and the lessons we learned from this period helped shape modern legal protections we enjoy today. Oh, and if you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. Super curious where you're all listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Always blows my mind how people are falling asleep to this all over the world. All right, find that cozy spot, take a nice slow breath, and just let your body sink into whatever you're lying on. We're heading back to explore one of the most important chapters in American colonial history. And trust me, you're going to appreciate that peaceful, quiet room and the legal protections you enjoy in the modern world, because what we're about to explore is a world where fear could override reason and justice. So let's dive deep into this incredible historical tale together. We'll follow the story of how Salem Village, Massachusetts, became the center of one of history's most studied examples of mass hysteria. It's February 1692, and we're about to witness how fear and suspicion can transform an ordinary community into something unrecognizable, and what we can learn from this period that helped build better societies. Our story begins in the depths of a harsh New England winter, when the snow lies thick on the ground and the nights stretch endlessly long. Salem Village in 1692 was not the charming tourist destination it would one day become. It was a challenging frontier settlement where life was difficult and survival required constant vigilance against both natural hardships and, according to contemporary beliefs, supernatural influences that shaped their daily understanding of the world. But before we dive into the events that were about to unfold, let me paint you a picture of what daily life was like in this Puritan community, because understanding the world these people lived in is crucial to comprehending how things could go so wrong so quickly, and how their experiences helped us develop better systems today. Salem Village was a farming community of about 600 people, established as a separate entity from the more prosperous Salem town in 1672. The villagers lived in wooden houses clustered around a central meeting house, their windows glowing faintly with candlelight in the gathering dusk. These weren't the cozy log cabins you might imagine. They were practical structures where families worked together to maintain their households during the challenging Massachusetts winters. The daily routine was governed by the rising and setting of the sun and by the strict religious observances that defined Puritan life. Every day began before dawn with family prayers, followed by a breakfast of cornmeal-based foods or bread when families were fortunate enough to have flour. The community members would then head out to tend to their farms or shops, while managing households that required significant labor just to maintain basic survival. Children in Salem didn't have the extended childhood that we know today. By age 7 or 8, they were expected to contribute meaningfully to the family's survival. Girls helping with cooking, cleaning, and textile work. Boys assisting with farming and animal care. Education was limited and primarily focused on reading the Bible and basic arithmetic needed for trade. The Puritan worldview that dominated Salem was one where the supernatural was not a matter of superstition, but of accepted reality within their religious framework. These people lived in a universe where they believed God and spiritual forces were constantly at work in human affairs, where unexplained events could be interpreted through religious and supernatural lenses, and where community vigilance was considered essential for maintaining spiritual purity. Every unexplained event, a cow that stopped producing milk, a child who fell ill with no apparent cause, a storm that destroyed crops, could potentially be interpreted through this supernatural framework. The Puritans believed that such difficulties might come either as tests of faith or as consequences of spiritual problems. But they also believed that malevolent forces could actively work to harm Christian communities. This worldview was reinforced by the challenging physical environment in which they lived. The Massachusetts frontier in 1692 was a dangerous place where difficulties could arise suddenly, and without warning. Native American conflicts were a constant concern. The community had vivid memories of King Philip's War just 16 years earlier. When entire settlements had faced destruction, wild animals posed threats to livestock and occasionally to people. Disease could sweep through a community rapidly before anyone understood what was happening. In this context of constant challenge and uncertainty, supernatural explanations for misfortune made sense within their religious framework. When you're living on the edge of survival and difficult things happen that you can't explain or control, the idea that spiritual forces might be responsible isn't just believable within that worldview. It provides a framework for understanding and potentially addressing the problems. The religious leadership in Salem was central to both the community's identity and the events that were about to unfold. Reverend Samuel Parris had arrived in Salem Village in 1689, and his tenure had been marked by controversy from the beginning. Unlike his predecessors, Parris had demanded ownership of the parsonage and its land, creating immediate conflict with villagers who felt he was overreaching his authority. Parris was a man convinced that Salem faced spiritual challenges even before the witchcraft accusations began. His sermons were filled with warnings about spiritual influences and the need for constant vigilance against moral corruption. He saw opposition everywhere, in the villagers who questioned his salary demands, in the competing faction that supported his rivals, and ultimately in anyone who challenged his authority or interpretation of events. The household where the crisis began was a microcosm of the tensions that existed throughout Salem Village. Parris lived with his wife Elizabeth, his 9-year-old daughter Betty, his 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams, and several household members, including Tituba, a woman from Barbados who had come to Salem via the West Indies slave trade. Tituba's presence in the Parris household would prove to be a crucial factor in how events unfolded. As someone from outside the Puritan culture, she brought with her knowledge of different cultural practices, spiritual beliefs, and folk traditions that were completely foreign to New England. Her stories of fortune-telling, spirit communication, and supernatural forces provided a framework that would later influence the accusations and confessions that drove the witch trials. The winter of 1691-1692 was particularly harsh. Even by New England standards, families were confined to their small houses for months on end, with little to do during the long dark evenings, except tell stories, read the Bible, and engage in the kind of intense social interaction that can breed both intimacy and conflict. In the Parris household, this meant that Betty and Abigail spent long hours listening to Tituba's tales of the supernatural world she had known in Barbados. It was during this claustrophobic winter that Betty Parris and Abigail Williams began exhibiting the unusual behaviors that would trigger the Salem witch trials. In January 1692, the two girls started having what were described as fits, sudden convulsions, periods of speechlessness, and episodes where they would display unusual behaviors that concerned their families and neighbors. Now, here's where it gets really interesting from a historical perspective. Because these symptoms weren't completely unprecedented in Puritan New England, similar cases of what were called spiritual afflictions had occurred in other communities, most notably in the Goodwin family in Boston in 1688. That case had been investigated by the prominent minister Cotton Mather, who had written about it extensively and concluded that supernatural forces were involved. So when Betty and Abigail began exhibiting similar symptoms, there was already a framework for understanding what might be happening within their communities. Belief system. Reverend Parris initially tried to handle the situation quietly, hoping that prayer and fasting might help his daughter and niece. But the girls' condition persisted rather than improved, and their unusual behaviors began to attract attention from neighbors and other children in the community. By February 1692, several other girls in Salem Village had begun exhibiting similar symptoms. Ann Putnam Jr., the 12-year-old daughter of one of Salem's most prominent families, started having fits and claiming to see things others couldn't see. Mercy Lewis, a 17-year-old servant, began claiming that she was being bothered by invisible forces. Mary Walcott, Elizabeth Hubbard, and Susanna Sheldon soon joined the growing circle of the afflicted. The spread of these symptoms to multiple girls created a crisis that the community could no longer ignore. When the local doctor, William Griggs, examined the girls and could find no physical cause for their condition, he offered the explanation that many in the community had already begun to suspect. The girls were victims of supernatural interference. This diagnosis transformed what had been a private family matter into a community emergency that demanded immediate action. If supernatural forces were actively attacking the children of Salem, then the entire community was believed to be in danger. The threat had to be identified and eliminated before it could spread further and destroy the godly community that the Puritans had worked so hard to build. But here's what makes this story even more instructive from a historical perspective. The way the initial accusations were made reveals the deep social tensions and prejudices that existed beneath the surface of Puritan community life. When the afflicted girls were finally pressured to name their supposed tormentors, they didn't point fingers at random people. Their accusations targeted individuals who were already marginalized and vulnerable within the community. Sarah Good was the first person accused. She was a woman experiencing homelessness who survived by asking for help from door to door, often accompanied by her young daughter Dorcas. Good was exactly the kind of person who was vulnerable to supernatural accusations within this community framework. She was poor, desperate, and had a reputation for responding to rejection with sharp words and expressions of frustration. When neighbors refused to help her, she sometimes muttered under her breath or made comments that could later be interpreted as threats or complaints. The fascinating and concerning thing about Sarah Good's case is how her poverty and desperation were reframed as evidence of supernatural wrongdoing. Her requests for help were interpreted as attempts to gain entry to houses where she could work malevolent influence. Her sharp tongue became evidence that she was pronouncing curses on those who refused to help her. Her very appearance, disheveled and desperate after years of homelessness, was seen as proof that she had abandoned Christian virtue in favor of evil influences. Sarah Osborne, the second person accused, represented a different type of vulnerability. She was an elderly woman who had scandalized the community years earlier by living with an Irish indentured servant named Alexander Osborne before marrying him. This relationship had violated multiple social norms. Not only had she lived in sin, but she had crossed class and ethnic boundaries by marrying someone beneath her social station. Osborne had also been involved in a bitter legal dispute with her deceased first husband's family over property rights. In Puritan society, where women's legal rights were severely limited, her attempts to control her own property had marked her as inappropriately independent and possibly grasping. Her irregular attendance at church services further marked her as someone whose commitment to the community's religious values was questionable. The third initial accusation fell on Tituba, and her case reveals the racial and cultural prejudices that shaped Salem's response to the crisis. As an enslaved woman from the Caribbean, Tituba was already marked as an outsider in the overwhelmingly white English Puritan community. Her knowledge of different cultural and religious practices made her suspect in the eyes of people who saw any deviation from strict Puritanism as potentially dangerous. What happened next would prove to be crucial in escalating the crisis beyond anything the community had experienced before. When these three women were brought before the magistrates for examination in early March 1692, their responses took dramatically different forms that would establish the pattern for everything that followed. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne maintained their innocence, denying any involvement with supernatural wrongdoing and insisting that they were good Christian women who had been falsely accused. Their denials, however, were met with skepticism from the magistrates, and were actually used as evidence against them. In the logic that developed during the witch trials, an innocent person was expected to confess their sins and seek forgiveness, while only someone truly corrupted by evil would persist in denying obvious guilt. Tituba's response was completely different, and it changed everything about how the Salem community understood the threat they believed they were facing under. Interrogation. She confessed not only to practicing supernatural arts, but to being part of a larger network of people engaged in similar activities, operating in and around Salem. Her detailed confessions described meetings with evil spirits, flights through the air to supernatural gatherings, and a network of other practitioners who were working together to harm the Christian community. Now, here's what makes Tituba's confession so historically significant. It provided exactly the kind of evidence that the magistrates and community leaders felt they needed to justify an expanded investigation, instead of dealing with 3 isolated cases of supernatural mischief. They now had what they interpreted as confirmation that Salem was under attack by an organized conspiracy of evil servants. Tituba's confessions were remarkably detailed and vivid, describing a supernatural world that seemed to parallel and threaten the everyday world of Salem Village. She spoke of black dogs and red cats that served as messenger spirits, of books written in blood where practitioners recorded their allegiance to Satan, and of midnight meetings where evil spirits appeared as tall, dark figures who promised their servants power and wealth in exchange for their souls. These confessions had several effects that would prove crucial to the escalation of the witch trials. First, they seemed to confirm the magistrates' belief that supernatural wrongdoing was not just a theoretical possibility, but an active threat to their community. Second, they suggested that the 3 women who had been accused were not isolated practitioners, but part of a larger network that included other, as yet unidentified individuals. Third, they provided a template for future confessions that other accused people could follow. But there's something else about Tituba's confession that modern historians find particularly significant. It may have saved her life. While Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne would both die in jail before they could be tried, Good after giving birth to a child who died in custody, Tituba's willingness to confess and cooperate with the authorities spared her from the ultimate penalties. This created a perverse incentive structure where telling the truth about one's innocence was punished, while providing false confessions about supernatural crimes was rewarded. The examination of these 3 women took place in Salem Village's meeting house, packed with curious and fearful community members who had never witnessed anything like the proceedings they were about to see. The afflicted girls were present, and their dramatic responses to the accused women provided what many observers considered to be compelling evidence of supernatural activity. When Sarah Good was brought before the magistrates, the afflicted girls immediately began writhing and claiming that Good's spectral form was pinching, biting, and otherwise tormenting them. The girls described seeing Good's ghost even as her physical body stood quietly in front of the magistrates, creating the impression that she possessed supernatural powers that allowed her to be in 2 places at once. The concept of spectral evidence, testimony about events that could only be seen by specially sensitive individuals, was controversial, even in 1692. Some ministers and legal authorities questioned whether such evidence should be accepted in court, arguing that evil spirits might be able to appear in the form of innocent people in order to confuse investigators and cause harm to the righteous. But the magistrates presiding over the Salem examinations, particularly Chief Justice William Stoughton, were convinced that spectral evidence was not only reliable, but essential to uncovering the supernatural conspiracy they believed threatened their community. In their view, God would not allow evil spirits to impersonate truly innocent people, so anyone whose spectral form was seen tormenting the afflicted must be guilty of supernatural wrongdoing. This acceptance of spectral evidence created a legal system where conviction was virtually inevitable. How could someone prove that their ghostly form wasn't attacking people in the invisible world? How could they demonstrate that they weren't flying through the air at night to attend evil meetings? The very nature of the evidence made it impossible to disprove, creating a situation where accusation became synonymous with conviction. The examinations also revealed the way that social tensions and personal conflicts could be reframed as supernatural struggles between good and evil. When Sarah Good was pressed to explain why the children were accusing her, she suggested that perhaps Sarah Osborne was responsible for their afflictions. This attempt to deflect blame onto a fellow accused person was interpreted as evidence of the divisions and conflicts that existed within the supposed supernatural conspiracy. Similarly, when the magistrates questioned the accused women about their relationships with their neighbors, every past dispute or argument became potential evidence of supernatural malevolence. A disagreement over property boundaries could be reinterpreted as a practitioner's attempt to gain access to a neighbor's land for magical purposes. A sharp exchange of words during a business transaction could be seen as the pronouncement of a supernatural curse. As news of the examinations spread throughout Essex County and beyond, more and more families began to wonder whether their own unexplained misfortunes might also be the result of supernatural interference, cattle that had sickened and died, children who had fallen ill without apparent cause, accidents that had befallen family members. All of these events were suddenly viewed through the lens of supernatural suspicion. The afflicted girls, meanwhile, found themselves in a position of unprecedented power and attention. These were mostly young women and girls from relatively humble backgrounds who suddenly had the ability to accuse anyone in the community of supernatural crimes and have their accusations taken seriously by magistrates, ministers, and other authority figures. It's important to understand that in Puritan society, young women typically had very little power or influence. They were expected to be silent, obedient, and deferential to their parents, husbands, and community elders. The witch trials temporarily inverted this social hierarchy, giving young women the ability to make accusations that could destroy the lives and reputations of adults who had previously held authority over them. The psychological dynamics of this situation were complex and are still debated by historians today. Some of the afflicted girls may have genuinely believed that they were experiencing supernatural attacks. Others may have been caught up in the attention and excitement that their accusations generated. Still others might have been influenced by suggestion, peer pressure, or the expectations of the adults around them. What seems clear is that once the accusations began, they took on a momentum of their own that became increasingly difficult for anyone to control. Each new accusation created fresh panic and suspicion, leading to more examinations, more confessions, and more accusations in an ever-escalating spiral of fear and paranoia. By late March 1692, the circle of the accused had expanded far beyond the three initial suspects. Martha Corey, a church member known for her piety, was accused after she had the courage to suggest that the afflicted girls might be mistaken about their supernatural tormentors. Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old woman revered throughout the community for her goodness and charity, found herself accused, despite having 39 neighbors sign a petition testifying to her character. The accusation of Rebecca Nurse sent shockwaves through Salem village and the surrounding communities. If someone of her stature and reputation could be accused of supernatural wrongdoing, then literally no one was safe from suspicion. The fact that her accusers were willing to target such a respected figure suggested either that the supernatural conspiracy was far more extensive than anyone had imagined, or that the accusation process itself had spiraled out of control. Rebecca Nurse's case also highlighted the way that the witch trials could be influenced by long-standing family feuds and property disputes. The Nurse family had been involved in boundary disputes with the Putnam family for years, and it was Ann Putnam Jr., daughter of Thomas Putnam, who was the primary accuser against Rebecca Nurse. The supernatural accusations provided a way to settle scores and gain advantages in conflicts that had nothing to do with actual supernatural wrongdoing. The examination of Rebecca Nurse took place on March 24, 1692, and it drew the largest crowd yet seen at the Salem proceedings. The meeting house was packed with people who had come to see whether this beloved elderly woman would confess to supernatural crimes or maintain her innocence in the face of the testimony against her. Nurse's dignified denial of the charges and her obvious confusion about why she was being accused created doubt in the minds of some observers. Here was a woman who had lived 71 years in the community without ever being suspected of anything, worse than occasional sharp words during disputes with neighbors. The idea that she had been secretly serving evil forces for decades seemed to strain credibility even for people who believed strongly in the reality of supernatural threats. But the afflicted girl's dramatic responses to Nurse's presence seemed to provide compelling evidence of her guilt to many observers. They writhed and claimed to see her spectral form tormenting them, describing in vivid detail the supernatural attacks they claimed to be suffering. For many observers, these dramatic displays were more convincing than nurses' quiet denials. The magistrates who presided over these examinations were not trained lawyers or experienced judges. They were local officials who were trying to deal with an unprecedented crisis using whatever legal knowledge and precedents they could find. Most of their information about supernatural prosecutions came from English legal manuals and religious treatises that assumed the reality of supernatural crimes and provided guidance for detecting and punishing them. The most influential of these guides was probably A Guide to Grand Jurymen by Richard Bernard, which had been published in London in 1627 and was widely circulated in New England. Bernard's work provided detailed instructions for investigating supernatural cases, including the types of evidence that should be considered reliable and the approaches that should be used to encourage suspected practitioners to confess their crimes. Bernard's guide emphasized the importance of confessions in supernatural cases, arguing that such crimes were by their very nature difficult to prove through ordinary evidence. According to his instructions, investigators should use a combination of moral appeals, religious persuasion, and promises of mercy to encourage suspected practitioners to admit their guilt and provide information about their accomplices. This approach created a system where confession became both the primary goal of the investigation and the most reliable path to survival for accused individuals. Those who confessed were generally spared the ultimate penalties, while those who maintained their innocence faced almost certain conviction and severe consequences. The logic was that truly repentant sinners deserved mercy, while those who persisted in denying their crimes were too corrupted by evil to be saved. The pressure applied to accused individuals was enormous and came from multiple sources. They faced not only the threat of legal punishment, but also the spiritual anguish of being told that their immortal souls were in danger. Ministers visited them in jail, urging them to confess for the sake of their salvation. Family members pleaded with them to admit their guilt so that they might be spared severe consequences. Fellow prisoners who had confessed shared their stories and encouraged others to follow their example. For many accused individuals, the choice was agonizing. Confessing to crimes they hadn't committed went against everything they believed about truth and honesty. But maintaining their innocence seemed to guarantee their destruction. Some eventually succumbed to the pressure and provided confessions that followed the template established by Tituba and other early confessors. These confessions often included detailed descriptions of supernatural meetings, lists of other supposed practitioners, and accounts of evil rituals and magical practices. The confessors described flying through the air to attend gatherings in the woods around Salem, signing their names in evil books and receiving supernatural powers in exchange for their souls. What's particularly fascinating about these confessions is how they reflected and reinforced the fears and prejudices of the community. The evil spirits were typically described as dark-skinned figures, reflecting racial anxieties about outsiders and non-Europeans. The gatherings were said to take place in the forest, reinforcing fears about the wilderness that surrounded the Puritan settlements. The magical practices described often involved inversions of Christian rituals, such as mock communion services using red bread and wine. The confessions also revealed the way that gender dynamics influenced the witch trials. Male practitioners were described as holding positions of authority within the evil hierarchy, while female practitioners were typically portrayed as serving them in subsidiary roles. This reflected the patriarchal assumptions of Puritan society, where men were expected to lead and women were expected to follow, even in supernatural contexts. By April 1692, the jail in Salem village was overflowing with accused individuals awaiting trial. The conditions in these colonial jails were challenging by any standard. Cramped spaces with minimal amenities and limited protection from the elements. Prisoners were required to pay for their own food and bedding, and those who couldn't afford these necessities faced significant hardships. The psychological strain of imprisonment was compounded by the uncertainty about when trials would take place and what their outcomes might be. Some prisoners had been in jail for months without knowing whether they would eventually be convicted. Others faced the daily pressure of visitors who urged them to confess and implicate others in order to save themselves. Among the prisoners were people from all walks of life and social classes. There were poor women like Sarah Good, who had always lived on the margins of society, and wealthy merchants like Philip English, who had previously held positions of respect and authority in their communities. There were elderly people like Rebecca Nurse, who had lived long lives of apparent piety, and young people who were barely out of childhood. The diversity of the accused demonstrated that no one in Salem was safe from suspicion. Wealth, social status, age, gender, and previous reputation provided no protection against accusations. This realization created a climate of terror throughout the community, where people watched their words and actions carefully. Knowing that any misstep could result in accusations of supernatural crimes, the expansion of the accusations beyond Salem village to surrounding communities multiplied the scope of the crisis. People in Andover, Billerica, Beverly, and other Essex County towns found themselves caught up in the supernatural panic. In some cases, entire families were accused, creating situations where parents, children, and siblings faced the choice between implicating each other or maintaining their innocence in the face of almost certain conviction. The case of the Proctor family illustrates the devastating impact that the witch trials could have on family units. John Proctor, a successful farmer and tavern keeper, initially dismissed the accusations as the result of hysterical imagination or deliberate deception when his servant Mary Warren began exhibiting symptoms similar to those of the other afflicted girls. Proctor threatened to discipline her if she didn't stop what he saw as attention-seeking behavior. This rational response to what he perceived as manufactured hysteria immediately made Proctor suspect in the eyes of those who believed the supernatural explanation. When Mary Warren was pressured to name the practitioners who were tormenting her, she accused her own employer, claiming that Proctor's ghost had appeared to her and threatened her with violence if she revealed his supernatural activities. John Proctor's wife Elizabeth was also accused, despite being pregnant at the time. Their son William was arrested along with his parents, creating a situation where an entire family faced destruction because of their association with supernatural accusations. The economic consequences were immediate and devastating. With the family's breadwinners in jail, their farm and tavern business collapsed, leaving them facing financial ruin even if they survived the legal proceedings. The Proctor case also highlights the way that expressing skepticism about the witch trials could be interpreted as evidence of guilt. John Proctor's public doubts about the credibility of the afflicted girls and his questions about the reliability of spectral evidence were used against him as proof that he was trying to protect fellow practitioners and undermine the investigation of the supernatural conspiracy. This created a chilling effect throughout the community, where people became afraid to voice any doubts about the proceedings lest they themselves become targets of accusation. The witch trials created an atmosphere of total conformity, where questioning the official narrative became not just socially dangerous, but potentially life-threatening. The legal proceedings that were established to handle the flood of supernatural cases were unprecedented in both their scope and their procedures. In May 1692, Governor William Phips established a special court of oyer and terminer, meaning to hear and determine, to try the backlog of cases that had accumulated in the county jails. The court was presided over by Chief Justice William Stoughton, a Harvard-educated minister and politician who was convinced that Salem was under attack by a massive supernatural conspiracy. Stoughton's approach to the trials reflected his belief that showing mercy to practitioners would be equivalent to betraying God and the Christian community. Under his leadership, the court developed procedures that made conviction almost inevitable and acquittal nearly impossible. The most controversial aspect of the court's procedures was its acceptance of spectral evidence as legitimate proof of supernatural crimes, despite objections from some ministers and legal authorities who questioned the reliability of such testimony. Stoughton ruled that the afflicted girl's visions of ghostly attacks were admissible as evidence and could be used to convict defendants. This decision created a legal system where the invisible became visible, where testimony about events that could not be verified or witnessed by others was treated as concrete evidence of criminal behavior. Defendants found themselves in the impossible position of trying to prove their innocence of crimes that existed only in the spiritual realm and could only be perceived by their accusers. The first trial under the new court took place on June 2, 1692, with Bridget Bishop as the defendant. Bishop was in many ways an ideal target for the witch trials. She was a woman who had been married multiple times, operated a tavern that was rumored to be a gathering place for questionable activities, and dressed in a colorful, flamboyant style that set her apart from other women in the community. Bishop's trial established the pattern that would be followed. In subsequent cases, the afflicted girls provided dramatic testimony about her spectral attacks, describing how her ghost had appeared to them and threatened them with violence if they revealed her supernatural activities. Neighbors testified about strange events that had occurred in connection with Bishop, animals that had sickened after encounters with her, tools that had mysteriously broken, and other unexplained mishaps that were now interpreted as evidence of magical malevolence. Bishop's own defense was hampered by the court's rules and assumptions. When she denied the charges against her, her denials were interpreted as evidence of her hardened heart and unwillingness to repent. When she pointed out the logical flaws in the accusations, her arguments were dismissed as the clever deceptions of someone skilled in supernatural arts. The jury deliberated for only a short time before returning a guilty verdict. Bishop was sentenced to the ultimate penalty, and her case concluded on June 10, 1692, making her the first person to meet this fate in the Salem witch trials. Her case was treated as a public event, with crowds gathering to witness what they believed was justice being served against the forces of supernatural evil. But Bishop's case, rather than satisfying the community's need for action against the perceived supernatural threat, seemed to increase the pressure for more trials and more convictions. If one practitioner had been discovered and eliminated, logic suggested that others must be found and stopped as well. The witch hunt was gaining momentum that would prove increasingly difficult to control. The second session of trials took place in late June and early July 1692, with 5 more people convicted and sentenced to severe consequences. These included Sarah Good, Rebecca Nurse, Sarah Wilds, Elizabeth Howe, and Susanna Martin, a group that represented the diversity of people who had been caught up in the accusations. Sarah Good's trial was particularly poignant because it involved not only her own conviction, but also the accusation of her 4-year-old daughter, Dorcas. The idea that a child so young could be a practicing supernatural wrongdoer stretched credibility, even for people who firmly believed in the reality of such crimes. But the afflicted girls insisted that little Dorcas had also signed evil books and was tormenting them with her tiny spectral form. Rebecca Nurse's conviction was perhaps the most shocking to the community because of her long-standing reputation for piety and goodness. During her trial, the jury initially returned a verdict of not guilty, but Chief Justice Stoughton questioned this decision and sent them back to reconsider. When they returned with a guilty verdict, it sent a clear message that no one, regardless of their previous reputation or character, was safe from conviction if the afflicted girls accused them. The trials also revealed the arbitrary and inconsistent nature of the evidence that was being accepted by the court. Physical evidence that might have supported the defendants was ignored or reinterpreted as proof of guilt. When Rebecca Nurse was examined for supernatural marks, unusual moles, scars, or other skin irregularities that were believed to be signs of evil allegiance, the examination found nothing unusual, but rather than accepting this as evidence of her innocence, the court ruled that the absence of such marks simply proved that she was a particularly skilled practitioner who had hidden her supernatural affiliations. The psychological pressure on the juries was enormous. They were asked to make life and death decisions based on evidence that was often contradictory, unreliable, or impossible to verify. They faced intense social pressure to convict defendants who had been accused by the afflicted girls. But they also had to live with the knowledge that their decisions would result in severe consequences for their neighbors and community members. Some jurors later expressed regret about their decisions. Thomas Fisk, who served on several of the juries, eventually stated that he believed some of the people he had helped convict were innocent of the crimes charged against them. But during the trials themselves, the combination of social pressure, fear, and belief in the reality of the supernatural threat made conviction seem like the only reasonable option. The legal consequences that followed the trials were public events that drew large crowds of spectators. These proceedings were treated as community gatherings, where justice was believed to be served against supernatural evil forces. The psychological impact of these legal outcomes on the community was complex and contradictory. For those who believed in the reality of the supernatural conspiracy, the consequences provided a sense of relief and justice. The community had identified and eliminated the source of its supernatural troubles, and normal life could presumably resume. But for others, the severe outcomes raised troubling questions about the reliability of the evidence and the fairness of the proceedings. The sight of respected community members facing ultimate consequences while maintaining their innocence created cognitive dissonance for people who had assumed that guilty people would confess and innocent people would be spared. The trials continued. Through the summer of 1692, with more and more people being accused, examined, and convicted, August brought another round of severe legal consequences, with several more community members meeting their fate. The case of George Burroughs was particularly significant because he was a former minister of Salem village who had left the community several years earlier after disputes with congregation members over his salary and authority. His accusation and conviction suggested that even members of the clergy were not immune to supernatural corruption, reinforcing the belief that the evil conspiracy was far more extensive than anyone had initially imagined. Burroughs' case also illustrated how old grievances and conflicts could be reframed as supernatural accusations. His former parishioners testified about strange events that had occurred during his ministry, unexplained strength that allowed him to lift heavy objects, knowledge of events that had happened in his absence, and other occurrences that were now interpreted as evidence of supernatural powers granted by evil allegiance. At his legal conclusion, Burroughs delivered a passionate speech maintaining his innocence and recited the Lord's Prayer flawlessly, something that supernatural practitioners were supposedly unable to do. His eloquent defense of his character and his demonstration of Christian knowledge created such doubt among the spectators that some began to question whether an innocent man was facing severe consequences, but the authorities pressed forward with the legal proceedings, and Burroughs met his fate along with the 4 other condemned prisoners. The sight of a former minister facing ultimate consequences for supernatural wrongdoing sent shockwaves throughout New England and began to generate the first serious criticism of the Salem proceedings from outside the immediate area. Meanwhile, the accusations continued to spread in ways that would ultimately prove to be the trial's undoing. By late summer 1692, the afflicted girls had begun naming increasingly prominent and respectable people as their supernatural tormentors. Accusations were made against ministers' wives, wealthy merchants, and even members of the governor's own family. The accusation of Lady Mary Phipps, wife of Governor William Phipps, marked a turning point in how the colonial authorities viewed the witch trials. It was one thing to pursue cases against poor women, social outcasts, and people who had made enemies within their communities. It was quite another to suggest that the governor's own wife was in league with supernatural forces. Similarly, when the afflicted girls accused several prominent ministers of supernatural wrongdoing, it created a crisis within the religious establishment that had initially supported the trials. The idea that ordained ministers, men who had dedicated their lives to fighting evil and promoting Christian virtue, could be secret servants of dark forces seemed to strain credibility beyond the breaking point. These high-profile accusations forced colonial leaders to confront the possibility that the accusation process had spiraled out of control. If literally anyone could be accused of supernatural crimes based solely on the visions of the afflicted girls, then the entire legal and social system was at risk of collapse. But even as doubts about the trials began to emerge among political and religious leaders, the local machinery of accusation and prosecution continued to function. September brought another round of legal consequences, with several more community members facing severe outcomes. The case of Martha Corey was particularly tragic because she had been one of the first people to question the reality of the supernatural afflictions. Her rational skepticism about the girl's claims had made her an early target for accusation, and her fate served as a warning to anyone else who might be tempted to express doubt about the proceedings. Mary Eastie's case was notable for the dignity and courage she displayed throughout her ordeal. Sister to Rebecca Nurse, she had initially been accused, then released, when the afflicted girls briefly stopped claiming to be tormented by her spectral form. But when she expressed gratitude for her release and suggested that others might also be innocent, the girls renewed their accusations against her. Eastie's petition to the court, written shortly before her legal conclusion, became one of the most eloquent pleas for justice to emerge from the Salem witch trials. She accepted her own fate, but begged the authorities to be more careful in their future proceedings to ensure that innocent people were not wrongly convicted. Her dignified acceptance, while maintaining her innocence, created a powerful impression on many who witnessed her case. The case of Giles Corey, Martha's husband, provided perhaps the most dramatic example of resistance to the witch trial proceedings. When Corey was accused of supernatural wrongdoing, he made the extraordinary decision to refuse to enter a plea of either guilty or not guilty. Under English law, this meant that he could not be tried. But it also subjected him to a procedure called peine forte et dure, a process where heavy weights were applied until he either entered a plea or succumbed. Corey's decision to accept this painful procedure rather than participate in what he had come to see as a corrupt legal system was interpreted in different ways by different observers. Some saw it as evidence of his guilt and stubborn refusal to confess his sins. Others viewed it as a heroic act of resistance against an unjust system. Still others believed he was trying to preserve his property for his heirs, since conviction for supernatural crimes resulted in forfeiture of all assets to the state. For 3 days, Corey endured the agony of having heavy stones placed on his chest, while officials urged him to enter a plea. According to witnesses, his only words during this ordeal were requests for more weight. Either as a defiant gesture or as an attempt to hasten his end, when he finally succumbed on September 19, 1692, he became the only person in American history to meet this particular fate. Corey's ordeal marked a symbolic turning point in the Salem witch trials. The sight of an elderly man being slowly crushed for refusing to participate in legal proceedings that many were beginning to question created revulsion even among some who had previously supported the trials. By October 1692, opposition to the witch trials was growing both within Salem and in the broader intellectual community of New England. Increase Mather, one of the most respected ministers in the colony and father of Cotton Mather, who had initially supported the proceedings, published a treatise called Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits that questioned the reliability of spectral evidence. Mather's work was particularly significant because it came from someone with impeccable religious credentials who could not be dismissed as a skeptic or enemy of the faith. His argument that it were better that 10 suspected practitioners should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned provided a religious and moral framework for opposing the trials that carried weight with Puritan audiences. The political situation was also becoming untenable for Governor Phipps. The witch trials were consuming enormous resources in terms of time, money, and administrative attention. The jails were overflowing with accused individuals, the court system was backlogged with cases, and the controversy was beginning to damage Massachusetts's reputation with authorities in London. Perhaps most importantly, the accusations had begun to threaten people with sufficient political and economic power to fight back effectively. When wealthy merchants, prominent ministers, and members of influential families found themselves or their relatives accused of supernatural crimes, they had the resources and connections to mount effective opposition to the proceedings. On October 29, 1692, Governor Phipps dissolved the Court of Oyer and Termina, effectively ending the Salem witch trials. In his letter to authorities in London explaining this decision, Phipps cited the growing controversy over spectral evidence and the concern that innocent people might be suffering unjustly. A new court was established with different rules that excluded spectral evidence and required higher standards of proof for conviction. Under these new procedures, most of the remaining accused were quickly acquitted or had their cases dismissed. The few who were convicted had their sentences commuted by the governor, but the end of the trials did not immediately end the suffering. Of those who had been caught up in the accusations, many of the accused had spent months in jail under challenging conditions, losing their health, their property, and their standing in the community. Even those who were eventually acquitted often found their reputations permanently damaged by the stigma of having been accused of supernatural wrongdoing. The families of those who had faced the ultimate consequences dealt with the additional burden of grief and anger over their loved ones' unjust fates. They also faced practical problems, since conviction for supernatural crimes had resulted in the forfeiture of the victim's property to the state. Widows and children were left destitute, their inheritance confiscated as the supposed profits of supernatural crime. The psychological scars left by the witch trials proved to be long-lasting and deep. People who had lived through the terror of 1692 remained suspicious and fearful for years afterward. Families remained divided by the accusations and counter-accusations that had torn them apart. The social fabric of Salem village was permanently damaged by the experience of having neighbors turn against neighbors in an orgy of supernatural suspicion. The afflicted girls, who had been the catalysts for the entire crisis, faced their own complex aftermath. Some, like Abigail Williams, disappeared from the historical record after the trials ended, their fates unknown. Others, like Ann Putnam, Jr., eventually issued public apologies for their role in the proceedings. Though these apologies came only after many years had passed, Ann Putnam's apology, delivered in 1706 when she sought to join the Salem Village Church, provides insight into how at least one of the accusers came to understand her role in the tragedy. She claimed that she had been deluded by Satan and that she had not intended to cause harm to innocent people. Whether this represented genuine remorse or a calculated attempt to rehabilitate her reputation remains a matter of historical debate. The ministers and magistrates who had presided over the trials also faced difficult reckonings with their roles in the proceedings. Some, like Samuel Sewall, eventually issued public apologies for their participation. Sewall's apology, read aloud in church in 1697, accepted responsibility for his role as a judge and asked for forgiveness from both God and the community. Judge William Stoughton, who had been the driving force behind the trial's harsh procedures, never acknowledged any wrongdoing, he maintained. Until his death, that Salem had indeed been under supernatural attack and that the court had been justified in its actions, his unrepentant stance reflected the difficulty that some participants had in accepting that they might have been wrong about such fundamental matters. Cotton Mather, the prominent minister who had initially supported the trials and written extensively about supernatural phenomena, also struggled with the aftermath of Salem. While he never fully repudiated his belief in supernatural forces, he became more cautious about endorsing legal proceedings based on supernatural claims and more critical of the types of evidence that had been accepted at Salem. The economic consequences of the witch trials extended far beyond the immediate costs of the legal proceedings. Salem Village's reputation was severely damaged, making it difficult to attract new residents or business investment. Property values declined as people associated the area with supernatural danger and social instability. Many families that had been touched by the accusations chose to leave Salem entirely, seeking fresh starts in communities where they would not be constantly reminded of their ordeal. This migration scattered the survivors and made it more difficult for the community to heal from its trauma. The witch trials also had lasting effects on the development of American legal and political institutions. The controversy over spectral evidence contributed to the development of more rigorous standards for evidence in criminal proceedings. The recognition that innocent people had been wrongly convicted helped to strengthen protections for the accused, and the principle that it is better to let guilty people escape than to convict the innocent. The Salem experience also contributed to a growing skepticism about supernatural prosecutions throughout the Western world. While belief in supernatural forces persisted for many years after 1692, the legal prosecution of alleged practitioners became increasingly rare and controversial. Salem served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing supernatural fears to override rational legal procedures. In the decades following the trials, various attempts were made to provide restitution to the victims and their families. In 1711, the Massachusetts General Court passed a bill reversing the convictions of many of those who had faced consequences and providing some financial compensation to their heirs. However, this compensation was often inadequate and came too late to prevent the financial ruin of many families. The process of historical memory and interpretation began almost immediately after the trials ended. Different groups within Salem and the broader New England community developed competing narratives about what had happened and why. Some continued to believe that real supernatural practitioners had been active in Salem, while others came to see the entire episode as a case of mass hysteria and judicial error. These competing interpretations reflected broader tensions within Puritan society about the nature of evidence, the role of the supernatural in daily life, and the proper relationship between religious and secular authority. The witch trials had raised fundamental questions about how communities should respond to unexplained phenomena and how legal systems should handle cases involving supernatural claims. The literary and cultural impact of the Salem witch trials began to emerge within decades of the events themselves. Ministers and historians wrote accounts that attempted to explain what had happened and draw lessons from the tragedy. These early works established many of the themes and interpretations that would influence later understanding of the trials. One of the most influential early accounts was Robert Califf's More Wonders of the Invisible World, published in 1700. Califf was a Boston merchant who had been critical of the trials from early on, and his book provided a detailed critique of the proceedings and the reasoning that had supported them. His work was particularly critical of Cotton Mather's role in promoting belief in supernatural forces and supporting the trials. Califf's book was controversial when it was published, and Cotton Mather reportedly had copies burned in Harvard Yard. But it provided an alternative narrative to the official accounts of the trials and helped to establish a tradition of critical analysis that would influence later historians. The 18th century brought new perspectives on the Salem witch trials as Enlightenment thinking began to influence American intellectual life. Writers and thinkers who emphasized reason, empirical evidence, and natural explanations for phenomena were naturally critical of proceedings that had been based on supernatural claims and spectral evidence. Thomas Hutchinson's History of the EU, Province of Massachusetts Bay, published in the 1760s, provided one of the first systematic historical analyses of the witch trials. Hutchinson, who later became the Royal Governor of Massachusetts, approached the trials as a case study in the dangers of religious enthusiasm and mob psychology. The American Revolution and its aftermath brought new political meanings to the Salem witch trials. Critics of British rule sometimes compared their situation to that of the accused individuals, arguing that they too were being persecuted by an unjust legal system. The trials became a symbol of the dangers of arbitrary authority and the importance of constitutional protections for individual rights. The 19th century saw the emergence of more sophisticated historical and psychological analysis of the Salem witch trials. Writers began to explore the social and economic factors that had contributed to the accusations, moving beyond simple explanations based on superstition or religious fanaticism. Charles Wentworth Upham's massive 2-volume study, Salem Witchcraft, published in 1867, provided the most detailed examination of the trials that had yet been attempted. Upham meticulously traced the property disputes, family feuds, and factional conflicts that had shaped the pattern of accusations, arguing that the trials were fundamentally about social and economic tensions rather than supernatural beliefs. Upham's work was groundbreaking in its attention to the material conditions and social dynamics that had influenced the trials. However, his interpretation was also shaped by the assumptions of his own time, including beliefs about the intellectual and moral superiority of the 19th century over the 17th century. The 20th century brought new analytical frameworks to the study of the Salem witch trials. Sociologists began to examine them as examples of mass hysteria and collective behavior. Psychologists explored the mental states of the accusers and the accused. Feminist scholars investigated the gender dynamics that had made women particularly vulnerable to accusations. Marion Starkey's 1949 book, The Devil in Massachusetts, brought techniques from psychology and sociology to bear on the Salem story, arguing that the trials represented a form of mass psychosis that could be understood in terms of modern psychological theory. Her work was influential in popularizing the idea that the trials were primarily a psychological rather than religious phenomenon. The 1950s brought new political relevance to the Salem witch trials with the rise of McCarthyism and the communist investigations. Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, first performed in 1953, used the Salem trials as an allegory for the persecution of alleged communists in Cold War America. Miller's play helped to establish the trials as a permanent part of American cultural memory and political discourse. The Crucible was particularly effective in highlighting the moral choices faced by individuals caught up in systems of persecution and false accusation. The play's focus on John Proctor's decision to maintain his integrity rather than save his life by confessing to crimes he didn't commit resonated with audiences who were witnessing similar dilemmas in their own time. The Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s brought additional layers of meaning to the Salem witch trials as Americans grappled with questions of racial justice and the protection of minority rights. The trials came to be seen as an early example of how fear and prejudice could override legal protections and lead to the persecution of vulnerable groups. Feminist scholars of the 1970s and 1980s brought new attention to the gender dynamics of the Salem witch trials. They noted that the majority of the accused were women and explored how the trials reflected broader patterns of patriarchal oppression and the targeting of women who violated social norms. Carol Carlson's 1987 book, The Devil in the Shape of E. A Woman, provided a comprehensive feminist analysis of the witch trials, arguing that they represented an attempt to control women's economic and social autonomy. Carlson's work was influential in shifting scholarly attention toward the gender implications of the trials. Recent scholarship on the Salem witch trials has become increasingly sophisticated in its attention to multiple factors and competing interpretations. Historians now recognize that the trials resulted from a complex interaction of religious beliefs, social tensions, economic conflicts, psychological factors, and political pressures. Mary Beth Norton's 2002 book, In the Devil's Snare, emphasized the role of the ongoing frontier wars with Native Americans in creating the climate of fear and suspicion that made the witch trials possible. Norton argued that the trauma of warfare and the threat of Indian attacks had created a psychological environment where supernatural explanations for misfortune seemed plausible. Stacy Schiff's 2015 book, The Witches, provided a comprehensive, narrative account that emphasized the agency and complexity of the female accusers, challenging earlier interpretations that had portrayed them primarily as victims or passive instruments of larger social forces. Contemporary scholars continue to find new angles and insights in the Salem witch trials, demonstrating their ongoing relevance for understanding human psychology, social dynamics, and the functioning of legal and political systems. The trials serve as a kind of historical laboratory for examining how fear, prejudice, and institutional failure can combine to produce tragic outcomes. One of the most important lessons that emerges from studying the Salem witch trials is the danger of allowing fear to override critical thinking and due process. When communities become convinced that they face an existential threat, they may be willing to abandon the very principles and protections that make civilized life possible. The trials also demonstrate the importance of protecting minority rights and unpopular opinions. In Salem, being different, expressing dissent, or challenging popular beliefs could literally be a matter of life and death. Modern democratic societies depend on the protection of diverse viewpoints and the rights of those who disagree with majority opinion. The Salem witch trials highlight the crucial role of evidence and burden of proof in legal proceedings. The acceptance of spectral evidence, testimony about events that could not be verified or witnessed by others, created a legal system where accusation was tantamount to conviction. Modern legal systems have developed elaborate protections against unreliable evidence, precisely because of lessons learned from cases like Salem. Perhaps most importantly, the Salem witch trials remind us that justice depends not just on good laws and institutions, but on the courage of individuals to speak out against injustice even when it's dangerous to do so. Those who questioned the trials, defended the accused, or later admitted their mistakes, showed the kind of moral courage that every society needs to prevent such tragedies from recurring. The educational value of studying the Salem witch trials extends far beyond their historical significance. They provide insights into human psychology, social dynamics, legal systems, and the conditions that can lead to mass hysteria and scapegoating. Understanding these patterns can help modern societies recognize and resist similar phenomena when they emerge in contemporary contexts. The trials also offer important lessons about the development of American legal and political institutions. The protections for the accused that we take for granted today, the presumption of innocence, the right to legal counsel, the requirement for reliable evidence, the protection against self-incrimination, are partly the result of lessons learned from tragedies like Salem. The victims of the Salem witch trials deserve to be remembered not just as casualties of a bygone era's ignorance, but as individuals whose lives and suffering continue to teach us important lessons about the fragility of justice and the constant vigilance required to protect it. Their names: Sarah Good, Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, Bridget Bishop, and all. The others represent real people who suffered because their community lost its way, but their memory also represents hope, because the fact that we now recognize their innocence and mourn their fate shows that human societies are capable of learning from their mistakes and developing better ways of seeking truth and administering justice. The Memorial to the Victims of the Salem witch trials, erected in Salem in 1992 on the 300th anniversary of the events, bears witness to this capacity for learning and growth. The inscription reads, "In memory of those innocents who died during the Salem village witchcraft, hysteria of 1692. The word innocence is particularly significant because it represents an official acknowledgement that those who faced consequences were victims of injustice rather than practitioners of supernatural evil. This recognition came 3 centuries late, but it demonstrates that the arc of history can indeed bend toward justice when people are willing to confront uncomfortable truths about their past. The Salem witch trials also serve as a reminder of the importance of education and critical thinking in maintaining a just society. The people of Salem in 1692 were not unusually ignorant or evil. They were operating within a worldview that made supernatural explanations seem reasonable and necessary. But their willingness to act on unverified accusations and their failure to question the reliability of spectral evidence led to tragic consequences. Modern education systems have developed partly in response to lessons learned from episodes like Salem. The emphasis on scientific method, critical thinking, and empirical evidence that characterizes modern education is designed to help people distinguish between reliable and unreliable information, to question authority when necessary, and to resist the kind of mass hysteria that consumed Salem in 1692. The legal protections that modern democracies provide for the accused are also partly the result of lessons learned from Salem and similar tragedies. The requirement for physical evidence, the right to confront accusers, the presumption of innocence, and other fundamental principles of due process are designed to prevent the kind of judicial injustices that occurred in Salem. But perhaps the most important lesson of Salem is that these protections are not automatic or permanent. Every generation must choose whether to maintain or abandon the principles that separate justice from vengeance, reason from hysteria, and civilization from chaos. The same human impulses that drove the witch trials, fear, prejudice, the need for scapegoats, the desire for simple explanations to complex problems, continue to exist in modern society. The challenge for contemporary societies is to learn from Salem's example while remaining vigilant against the emergence of similar patterns in new forms. Mass hysteria, scapegoating, and the persecution of minority groups continue to occur in the modern world, though they typically take different forms than supernatural accusations. The Salem witch trials remind us that the capacity for both good and evil, wisdom and folly, justice and injustice, remains constant across historical periods. The people of Salem in 1692 were not fundamentally different from people today. They had the same basic human nature, the same capacity for fear and courage, the same potential for making both good and bad decisions under pressure. What has changed is our understanding of how societies can protect themselves against the kind of breakdown that occurred in Salem. We have developed better legal systems, more sophisticated approaches to evidence, and stronger protections for individual rights. We have institutions of higher education and scientific research that help us distinguish between reliable and unreliable information, but we also have new challenges that the people of Salem could never have imagined. Modern communication technologies can spread false information and conspiracy theories with unprecedented speed and reach. Social media can amplify mass hysteria and create echo chambers where unreasonable beliefs are reinforced rather than challenged. Political polarization can make it difficult for people to agree on basic facts about reality. The lesson of Salem is not that we have overcome the human tendency toward fear and irrationality, but that we must remain constantly vigilant against these tendencies and work actively to maintain the institutions and principles that protect us from their worst consequences. As you settle into your comfortable bed tonight, safe from accusations and protected by legal systems that have learned from Salem's mistakes, you can appreciate how far human society has come in developing protections for the accused and standards for evidence. The presumption of innocence, the right to legal representation, the requirement for reliable evidence, and other due process. Protections that we take for granted are partly the result of lessons learned from tragedies like Salem, but the Salem witch trials also remind us that these protections are not automatic or permanent. They must be actively maintained and defended by people who understand their importance and are willing to stand up for them when they come under threat. The question is not whether we are immune to the kind of mass hysteria that consumed Salem in 1692. We are not. The question is whether we have learned enough from that tragedy to recognize the warning signs when they appear and to have the courage to resist them. The ghosts of Salem are not supernatural spirits seeking revenge, but the memory of real people who suffered because their community lost its way. They remind us that the price of freedom and justice is eternal vigilance, and that the responsibility for maintaining civilized society rests with each of us. Sleep peacefully tonight, knowing that you live in a time and place where the nightmare of Salem is unlikely to be repeated in exactly the same form, but sleep also with the understanding that the human capacity for both wisdom and folly remains unchanged, and that the lessons of Salem must be learned anew by each generation. The witch trials of 1692 lasted only about 10 months, but their impact on American culture and legal development has been profound and lasting. They serve as a permanent reminder that civilized society is fragile, that justice requires constant protection, and that ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil when fear overcomes reason. But they also remind us of the human capacity for growth, learning, and redemption. The fact that Salem eventually recognized its mistake, that some participants expressed regret, and that society developed better protections against such injustices, shows that humans are capable of learning from their darkest moments. The Salem witch trials teach us that we must always be skeptical of claims that cannot be verified, suspicious of accusations that target the powerless and different, and protective of those who express unpopular opinions or challenge conventional wisdom. They remind us that the most dangerous enemies of justice are often not obvious villains, but ordinary people who allow fear to cloud their judgment. As you drift off to sleep, carry with you both the sobering lessons and the hopeful examples from Salem's tragedy. The witch trials show us humanity at its worst, but they also challenge us to be better, more thoughtful, more compassionate, more committed to truth and justice than those who allowed that nightmare to occur. The people of Salem in 1692 were not monsters or aliens. They were humans like us, with the same capacity for both good and evil, wisdom and folly, courage and cowardice. The choices they made in that terrible year remind us that the choices we make in our own lives matter just as much, and that the quality of our society depends on our willingness to choose justice over convenience, truth over prejudice, and compassion over fear. Rest now in the knowledge that you are protected by legal systems and social institutions that have learned from Salem's mistakes. But remember, too, that these protections depend on citizens who understand their importance and are willing to defend them when they come under threat. The Salem witch trials remind us that the arc of history does not automatically bend toward justice. It must be bent by people who understand the difference between right and wrong, and who have the courage to act on that understanding, even when it's difficult or dangerous to do so. Sleep peacefully, but sleep also with the wisdom that comes from understanding how quickly civilization can unravel when fear overcomes reason, and how important it is for each of us to be guardians of the principles that make just and decent society possible. The memory of Salem's victims calls us to be better than those who condemned them, to be wiser than those who believed impossible accusations, and to be more committed to truth and justice than those who allowed fear to guide their decisions. In the end, the Salem witch trials offer us both a warning and a promise. A warning about what can happen when communities lose their way, and a promise that human societies are capable of learning from their mistakes and building better, more just institutions. The choice between these two possibilities remains ours to make, every day and in every generation.